I think that Donald Trump's presidency could have a fundamental impact on the security architecture of the world. It is quite possible he might push many countries, including NATO countries, towards China and away from the US. And the bigger the rift between US and Europe, the less powerful American hegemony and less powerful Western domination of the world. That J.D. Vance essentially drew a line saying, we believe in freedom of speech, you don't. And as long as you don't believe in freedom of speech, we are not going to support you, your democracy, your institutions, your wars. That is it, period. Welcome to Khanversations. I'm Muqtedar Khan, your host, and today I'm going to talk about the war of words that is taking place between the allies across the Atlantic, the United States versus Europe. There seems to be a tremendously strong words exchange between the president of Germany as well as the president of Ukraine responding to Vice President J.D. Vance's speech at the Munich conference. If you remember, when Kamala Harris went there, she gave a speech before the invasion in 2022, before the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, where she focused upon the importance of U.S. commitment to the security of Europe and the importance of including Ukraine in NATO. I remember when I listened to the speech, I thought, oh my God, this is an invitation for Putin to invade Ukraine. And if you all recall, I had already predicted, in fact, months before the invasion that Russia was going to attack Ukraine, and it had no choice but to do that. But today I'm going to talk about J.D. Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference, the most important security conference in Europe. And I will also talk to you about the responses that European leaders came up with, especially Olaf Scholz, who is the Chancellor of Germany, and Zelensky's response, which was very interesting. And then, of course, Donald Trump also chimed in. So there is a very heated dialogue going across the Atlantic, and it is probably going to determine the future of US-Europe relations going forward. But before that, do subscribe to Khanversations, like this video, press the bell icon, and share this video with your social political network. So first thing, J.D. Vance's speech came as a huge surprise and a shock to the Europeans. And the purpose of the shock was because he did not talk about what people usually talk about. It's a conference about international security. It is about security of Europe primarily. But as Dr. Jaishankar, India's foreign minister, once said, Europe treats Europe's problems as if they are the world's problems, without ever worrying about the problems that the rest of the world has. And so even though it is about the security of Europe, you will see prominent leaders from all over the world. The Chinese deputy foreign minister, I think, spoke there, and there are obviously American leaders, etc., all coming there, and all scholars and professors and senators, etc., all concerned about the security of Europe, as if Europe is the most important part of the world. At least at the Munich conference, it does appear as if the whole world cares about the security of Europe. So J.D. Vance comes to Europe and basically says at the Munich conference that I'm not here to talk to you about this threats to Europe from external security. I'm not interested in talking about what threat Russia or China present to Europe. I'm going to talk about threats that are from within, the threats that Europe or some Europeans present to Europe. And so he basically decides to criticize the how should we say, the decline of democratic values in Europe. It's pretty rich. It was, when I saw that, I was just tickled pink. J.D. Vance, of all people, the Republican Party vice president, his party is banning books in Florida, and anybody who has anything sensible to say or critical to say about the Middle East crisis, these guys come crashing down on them. So there is no freedom of speech in this country on so many issues. and he's lecturing others on freedom of speech. It was pretty rich, but it was a pretty good speech if you ignore the American side of the hypocrisy. And I'll talk a little bit more about the speech itself. So he basically was trying to say that the threats to European democracy come from within Europe itself. And he points out to 3 or 4 things, basically trying to say that there is systematic bias against political parties which are on the right. And so he refers to this whole policy of canceling or isolating extreme right parties, even though they have representation. So basically, if you have a party like AFD, which is getting about 20% of the vote in the country, isolating it is like isolating 20% of the voices in the country. And so it's a very undemocratic practice. So he brings that up, not in so many words, but you should watch his speech. I'm not going to summarize his speech for you, but highlight some of the points. That's one of the points he made. The other point he tried to say was that there is an attempt to essentially marginalize and subvert and silence Christian and right-wing religious values. And he talks about how those who protest against abortions, even in the most peaceful way in Britain, were being prosecuted and were being jailed. And so there was a repression against certain kinds of views in Europe across the board, including in UK. He goes on to highlight basically discrimination and silence of speech. So he's saying that the most shocking thing to him was the cancellation of the presidential elections in Romania, where the judge alleged that because of Russian influence, basically via TikTok, that Romanians voted for a person who was sympathetic to Putin, and so the judge basically canceled the election. And that's quite shocking to say that, oh, there's so much of interference in American elections, not just from Russia or China. Everybody is trying to influence everybody's election. The Europeans, my goodness, in the name of democracy promotion, they are constantly interfering in societies in other countries. Even in the so-called democratic societies elsewhere, they are constantly trying to interfere and try to help those who they think. I mean, giving Obama the Nobel Prize, for example, for doing what? For just winning the election against John McCain. So the Europeans also interfere in other people's elections all the time. And they do it through civil society institutions. They do it through democracy promotion institutions. The United States also does that. There have been allegations that the United States has basically conducted a regime change in Bangladesh. And even though Sheikh Hasina won the elections, she was overturned through unconstitutional means or through protests, etc. So the Western countries all interfere in other societies, whether they're democratic or not. But J.D. Vance lecturing the Europeans on this was pretty sweet. Actually, I enjoyed it a lot. And the Europeans were very tired. And so it was very telling. What he said was that this whole business of why we support and fund projects in Europe, and we support and fund Europe's security, is because of this issue of shared values, and the shared values is democracy. And if the Europeans are going to abandon democracy, if the Europeans are going to abandon freedom of speech, then we have nothing in common, and so we are not going to support Europe and Europe's security. So basically, they are using the decline of democracy in Europe, decline of free speech in Europe, as a justification for probably walking out of NATO and not supporting the war in Ukraine. That was essentially his entire summary. So, but the examples that he gave were interesting. I mean, we are witnessing a democratic decline worldwide. In fact, the United States itself is not considered a full-fledged democracy by the democracy index that is published by The Economist. And every day we see that democracy is retreating in democratic societies, mostly Western societies. So what J.D. Vance was pointing to, I think, is basically hypocrisy in the West, especially in European countries when it comes to freedom of speech. See, you can say any nasty things you like about Islam and about Muslims and about Islamic symbols. You can make cartoons about Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. You can burn the Quran and do whatever you like under freedom of speech, but try criticizing Israel in Germany and see what happens. So even in the United States now, in American universities, we are going to silence speech against criticism of Israel. So there are these double standards and hypocrisies on both sides of the Atlantic, even though both like to talk about the fact that they believe in freedom and democracy. So anyway, J.D. Vance's speech came as a bomb. Yes, people are prepared for a speech in which J.D. Vance would probably say that we are not going to support Ukraine's endless war, and we are going to get rid of the stupid commitment that Biden made that as long as it takes, I don't know what made Biden think. He thought he was going to be president forever, I think. He thought he was Xi Jinping, president forever. And so I will continue to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. Well, suddenly not. He lost the election, or his party does, and now Donald Trump is president. So I think the Europeans were basically getting ready to hear another lecture on NATO and European lack of European defense spending, the kind of speech that Pete Hegseth gave in Brussels. So that is what probably the Europeans were expecting. They did not expect a lecture on freedom of speech, essentially. So what is interesting is that J.D. Vance essentially drew a line saying, we believe in freedom of speech, you don't. And as long as you don't believe in freedom of speech, we are not going to support you, your democracy, your institutions, your wars. That is it, period. And what he means by freedom of speech is let everybody in the country speak, far right, far left, etc. Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor, who is contesting the current German elections, which are just around the corner, and he's expected to lose. He's one of the, I did a video called 3 Idiots in which I talked about Rishi Sunak, Trudeau, and Macron. I should have made it 4 idiots, and Olaf Scholz is one of them. Anyway, so Olaf Scholz basically comes up and responds, and it was interesting to see how some European Union leaders thought it was a brave speech and a great response to J.D. Vance. This is what Olaf Scholz says. He says the reason why we have isolated the right-wing party like AfD is because of our history. This speech was given just 20 miles away from one of the horrible camps where the Germans killed Jews in large numbers. When the Holocaust happened, over 6 million Jews were killed systematically, industrially, in the name of German nationalism. And so he said, because we have this terrible, terrible history, the Germans have committed the worst crime against humanity in the history of humanity. They should stop talking about, in my opinion, the Germans should simply shut up and not talk about human rights or democracy for another 1,000 years after what they did to the Jews in the Holocaust. They killed over 6 million Jews, nearly 40% of Jews that lived on the planet at that time. So anyway, so he says, because of our history, we will not tolerate. And so one of the big slogans after the awareness of the Holocaust became widespread is never again. Never again should this happen. And so he said, because we believe in this never again idea, we are going to basically indulge in curtailing certain speech, especially hate speech, etc. But this same hypocrite, Olaf Scholz, is a big supporter of the genocide that is going on in Gaza. It's not over fully. He denied that there was a genocide in Gaza. He is one of the 3 countries which provided the largest weapons to Israel during this war, US, UK, and Germany. And he's a supporter of what happened in Gaza. He's a genocide denier. Olaf Scholz is a genocide denier. And for him to come and talk about never again while he's funding and supporting a genocide and denying that it is happening, it's pretty rich. It is so typical of Western leaders who are so profoundly hypocritical that they condemn the very values that they are practicing at that very moment. This is not something that happened 70 years ago, 50 years ago. This is something that was happening until Donald Trump got elected and forced a ceasefire on Israel. Germany did nothing, absolutely nothing, except send weapons endlessly to Israel and deny the genocide that is taking place in Gaza. So for me, I had zero sympathy for this particular guy, and I have zero sympathy for the Germans. Okay, they are a hypocritical nation which has the worst human records history of humanity. They committed the worst crimes ever. Nothing that others have done comes close to what the Germans did. And so for them to come out and try to respond to J.D. Vance, I thought was rather ridiculous. And I'm quite stunned at how seriously some of the liberals in Europe are taking Olaf Scholz. I don't know why I keep saying George Scholz. George Scholz was an American. Olaf Scholz' response to the J.D. Vance. And hopefully we will never ever hear again from Olaf Scholz in a few weeks' time. J.D. Vance also went and met with the leader of AfD, Alternative for Deutschland or for Germany, this extreme right-wing party, which everybody seems to be determined to be excluded, but it is performing well in provisional elections. It has won like 20%, 30% in some provinces, and it is expected to do significantly well. And so there's this whole strategy to isolate them. But the worst thing that has happened is that was the election that was canceled in Romania because people didn't like the outcome of that election. And so J.D. Vance goes and meets with AfD. It's clear signal that the Trump administration, Elon Musk, J.D. Vance, and others are going to support extreme right-wing voices in Europe. The Donald Trump's party, you can't even call it Republicans, but the Trump party in the United States is an extreme right-wing party. And it's not a surprise that it is going to support extreme right-wing parties all over the world. That is why they get along so well with BJP and Narendra Modi, which is also an extreme right-wing party. There are lots and lots of right-wing Hindutva people who talk about committing genocide in India. They call it Dharm Sansad. Google Dharm Sansad genocide, and you will see what I'm talking about. So yes, this is a right-wing leader who's going to talk about supporting and promoting right-wing parties and their exclusion as undemocratic. Zelensky obviously is in deep trouble. I mean, he cannot say what he thinks or feels. I'm sure he must be shocked. He must be hating Donald Trump. He must be paranoid what Donald Trump will do. Imagine some other two people getting together and your country loses 20% of the land and you have nothing to say in it. And that's what the future he's expecting. So he basically came out there and he tried to encourage Europe into starting a European army to defend Europe. I mean, the whole plan that Zelensky has, that Europe should come together, forget about NATO, forget about the US. Europe should come up and build an army so it can defend Ukraine. Good luck with that. Europeans are incapable of defending themselves. And they're going to support Ukraine, my foot. But he said something which, if I was a European intellectual or a scholar, I would have been very upset. So he was objecting to the exclusion of Ukraine as well as Europe from the dialogue that the US is having with Russia in Saudi Arabia about the peace process. So it's quite possible that Donald Trump might even meet Vladimir Putin. And so Ukraine is saying you can't exclude us in discussion. So Donald Trump has said, no, we will not exclude Ukraine. We will include Ukraine. Unlike the European, whose position is that any attempt at peace negotiations should include Ukraine, and whatever Ukraine says is the final word. Trump is not saying that at all. Trump is saying what I say is the final word. Not only Putin, but Ukraine and Europeans, everyone will have to accept what I decide. So Zelensky comes to Munich and he says that it is unacceptable that any decision that is about Ukraine, if Europe is not included. So this is what he says. In every decision about Ukraine, Europe should be included. And every decision about Europe, Ukraine should be included. So he's trying to make Ukraine constitutive to Europe and trying to cement Ukraine as a European country. And J.D. Vance said very clearly, and so did Pete Hegseth, that not only that Ukraine should forget about ever becoming a member of NATO, but also should forget about getting back all of the land that they have lost to the Russians since 2014 onwards. So losing Crimea and then Donbass regions, most of what they have lost in this war also. So it is interesting that the war of words is heating up across the Atlantic. Donald Trump, when asked about J.D. Vance's speech, basically said it was a brilliant speech and he completely backs his vice president. So this week, Elon Musk is hammering Europe consistently on Twitter, on X, formerly Twitter, especially with regards to freedom of speech, especially in England. It is quite possible he might force England to have an early election and get rid of Starmer as a prime minister by raising issues which are sympathetic to extreme right-wing parties, extreme right-wing leaders. He's promoting Tommy Robinson, who's nothing but a hate monger. He's like the KKK of UK. KKK of UK. That sounds perfect for Tommy Robinson. Anyway, Elon Musk is really stirring the pot in Europe. Schulz also, in a separate interview, basically also criticized Vance for meeting with AfD and accused the United States of interfering in European elections and accused the Trump administration of interfering in German elections. The Germany exists as a democracy thanks to America. If we were not occupying Germany, I don't know what Germany would have become. So this idea of accusing the United States of interfering in German democracy, I think is idiotic. The US made Germany democratic. It was a fascist regime. So anyway, this is very interesting. It has very serious implications. It is quite possible that this anger and this vitriol that you're seeing in diplomatic systems could translate into the tariff war. Once that begins, Europeans might be foolish enough to retaliate against Donald Trump. If he were to impose the reciprocal, I haven't looked at the details of the reciprocal tariffs, but effectively, the US has imposed tariffs on every country in the world at the moment. Now, it depends on how much they themselves are charging. And Donald Trump made it very clear that the tariffs are not going to be, when he says reciprocal, he doesn't mean the same. So, for example, if Germany is charging America 5%, it's not going to be that the US is going to levy 5% against Germany. It could be 10%, it could be 15%, it could be 2%. He said he's also going to factor the cost of doing business. So if there is an additional cost of doing business, then he will add that to the tariffs. So it's going to be very interesting. I think that Donald Trump's presidency could have a fundamental impact on the security architecture of the world. It is quite possible he might push many countries, including NATO countries, towards China and away from the US. And the bigger the rift between US and Europe, the less powerful American hegemony and less powerful Western domination of the world. So anyway, I'm going to stop with that. I will continue to keep an eye on that. I am intrigued as a scholar who studies geopolitics and global order. And I am amused by the hypocrisy of J.D. Vance's speech. Everything that he accused the Europeans of is true, but it is also true of the US and Canada. So it's true of North America as well as Europe. But I think that we are seeing developments which are going to have a significant impact on global order and also the global economy. So anyway, thank you for watching Khanversations. Like this video, press the bell icon, subscribe to the channel if you have not already done so, and don't forget to share this video with your social political network. Until next time, I'm your host, Muqtedar Khan. Take care.